Hey everybody, welcome to the video. Let's go over the 7-game MLB DFS slate for today on Draftkings. But before we continue, as always, if you guys could just leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, you might as well hit that subscribe button. I'm going to be here all season long trying to help you guys become better MLB DFS players, and I cover other sports as well. So if you're going to keep coming back to the channel each and every single day, or each and every single week, you might as well hit that subscribe button, turn the notification bell so you don't miss out whenever I post new content. You can also follow me over on Twitter, Pennell16, cpen16 on IG. And if you want more content over on Patreon, it's always much appreciated. We got over 300 plus people in there, and it's a pretty good time. You can hop into the Discord chat, and you just get access to all the extra content, the cheat sheets, the spreadsheets, the top stacks tool, the data sheets, the projections, and all of that fun stuff. So if you're interested, links in the description below. If you're not, that's fine. Let's just dive into today's slate. So pitching. I only have 3 pitching options here. I know there's 14 options, which because there's 7 games, but wasn't a lot of guys I liked. I mean, Marquez and Paxton are both interesting. I did have them on here originally, but then I just said, yeah, you know what, I'm going to just leave this with 3, and because I'm most likely just going to end up going Corbin and Javier for the most part. Gausman maybe if I need the salary relief, but for the most part, I'm kind of sticking with these 3. Marquez is in a GPP spot versus the Rangers. We just saw how bad they were last night versus a much worse pitcher. And now you get German Marquez, who's definitely got some strikeout upside. He does struggle with lefties, so I do have some of the lefties on the Rangers listed. So that's why I didn't put Marquez, because I'm more likely to play the Rangers than I am Marquez on this slate. So I left them off here, but he is interesting in tournaments. James Paxton also threw 11 strikeouts in his last start. He's only 8,100, so I think that's a decent way to go in GPPs as well. But for the main part, these are my 3 guys that I was really looking at. So we'll start up top with Patrick Corbin. He's 10,500. He gets that soft matchup versus the Orioles. Now, I know the Orioles have had some decent games so far this season, but over the course of the year, I mean, they're going to not be a great offense. So I think we can certainly look at Patrick Corbin here with confidence. And through his 3 starts this season, he's been just fine. He scored 27 points versus the Yankees, 21 points versus the Mets. And then his next start versus the Mets, he scored 19. He saw his pitch count from 75, 102, and 87. Also, his strikeout numbers have been 8, 8, and 4. I mean, he's just a really good pitcher. I mean, he doesn't usually get talked up like some of the elite pitchers, but he's definitely got that kind of talent. And Vegas likes him as well. Only 3.82 runs against him, 64% chance for the win, which is going to be one of the highest on the slate. 6.5 strikeouts in Vegas. If you're looking at his numbers last season, 29% K rate, 3.59 xFIP, and he was elite versus lefties and gave a little bit of power versus righties, but still overall really good numbers. And if you're looking at the numbers last season for the Orioles versus left-handed pitching, they had a strikeout rate of 26.1%, only an 85 WRC plus, and a 301 WOBA and a 154 ISO. So this is a really good spot for Patrick Corbin. And I know it's a course slate, but I do feel pretty comfortable just throwing in Patrick Corbin for 10,500 and moving on, because the pitching on this slate is not that great. So I feel like just locking in the best pitcher is probably going to end up being the way to go, and I'd have to imagine a lot of people are just going to be locking him in as well. And then I already talked about the other guys that you could play, like Paxton and German Marquez, but I feel pretty comfortable here with Christian Javier at 7,400 as my SP2. Vegas really likes the Astros here. 65% chance for the win, 5.5 strikeouts in Vegas, and only 3.72 runs against them. Obviously, no stats from last year for Javier, but if you're looking at his numbers this season, he has been up and down. He scored 3 points versus Seattle in his first start of the season, but that was only when he went 1 inning, and he threw 16 pitches, so okay, who cares? So in his next start versus the Dodgers, he scored 25 fantasy points on 82 pitches, struck out 8. That's a pretty good outing. Then versus Arizona, decent outing, went 6 innings, 16 fantasy points, only 2 strikeouts, but threw 80 pitches. Then in his last start, he did struggle versus Oakland with only 3 fantasy points, 3 innings, 63 pitches, and only 5 strikeouts. And he gave up 5 runs on 3 hits and 2 walks. So he's had 2 okay outings, then one was only 1 inning appearance, so can't really put too much stock into that. So 2 good outings and then 1 kind of bad outing. But he's going up against Seattle, which is a pretty soft matchup here, and I think the Astros should be able to get him a win as long as he can go 5 innings, which he's done twice now. So I'm pretty confident in that. I don't think he's going to give up too many runs. There's some strikeout potential here as well. Seattle is a team that will strike out quite a bit versus both sides of the plate. Last season, they struck out 25.7% of the time versus right-handed pitching. Did have some power with a near 200 ISO, 316 WOBA, and a 100 WRC+. So I don't know if it's going to be like an exact walk in the park for Javier here, but the way the pitching is on the slate, he's kind of the guy that stood out to me as the clear SP2. Like, Heaney's going up against the Dodgers, Gibson's in Colorado. Paxton, I mean, he's okay. He's going up against Boston. There's some righties on there that I think could give him some issues, so I don't think he's completely safe. Buehler, he just seems a bit expensive versus the Angels, which I don't know, Buehler's an awesome pitcher, but I don't know, I just don't really feel like spending all the way up for him. I mean, he's maxed out at 87 pitches so far this season, and At 10,300, I feel much more comfortable with Corbin. We've seen him go over 100 pitches. And plus, Corbin's in a softer matchup versus the Orioles. And then I'm just kind of going down here. I mean, there's just no one else I really like. Alex Young, I wouldn't play. Eovaldi's going to be against the Yankees, which they are missing Aaron Judge and Carlos Stanton, so that's going to be a boost for him, but that's also a downgrade in the strikeout department, so you can look at that both ways. But yeah, really no one else at SP2 I like unless you want to punt with Kevin Gausman. He comes in at 6,200. There's no team total out yet for this game, but I do think he's interesting. He's actually been solid in 3 of his last 3 starts, actually, or 3 of his first 4 starts, I should say. He scored 16 points versus San Diego, 16 points in Coors Field, which is pretty impressive. And then versus the Dodgers, he scored 22, where he struck out 6. Didn't walk anybody through 80 pitches. So I think at 6,200, he's certainly interesting here versus Oakland. Now, Oakland's a good team, but if you're going to use pitchers versus them, you're going to want to use righties instead of lefties. So if you look at their splits, last season, only an 18% carry rate to lefties, over a 200 ISO, 115 WRC plus. Pretty scary numbers, but versus righties, those numbers do come down and up, I guess, if you're looking at the strikeout department. But so 22% carry rate compared to 18%, 187 ISO compared to a 222 ISO, 316 WOBA compared to a 341 WOBA, and 98 WRC plus compared to a 115 WRC plus. So I think the spot's okay for Gausman. I'm not expecting much out of him, but I do think he can get us anywhere from 12 to 18 points. I think that's in his wheelhouse. So I don't mind Gausman as a punt play, just to, if you want to fit in some extra bats. I mean, you can save 1,200 and go with Gausman. So I feel safer with Javier, but Gausman is a fine punt SB2 option. But that's pretty much it for the pitching. We can probably move on to the bats now at this point, which I got a lot of bats listed here. I know it's only a 7-game slate, but there's some good spots here. So pretty excited to talk about a few of these guys. But we'll start up top with catcher. Catcher is not exciting today. I'm probably just going to end up punting with Barnes, to be honest, but we'll see how my lineup construction looks. But Kurt Suzuki, 3,800. I like Washington quite a bit today. I'm surprised our team total is only 5.18. I thought it would be kind of higher, but Wojciechowski's not the worst pitcher in the world, but he's certainly not someone I'm going to shy away from. And especially if they get to him early on, they'll get to that Baltimore bullpen, which we know is just absolutely horrendous. So I do like the Nationals quite a bit in this game. I do prefer Suzuki versus left-handed pitching. I mean, he's got a 343 batting average and only a 12% K rate to lefties. And he's got some decent pop as well. But versus righties, his numbers aren't awful, but the batting average comes down to 240, only 11% strikeout rate, and still over a 200 ISO. So as long as he's in the lineup, I think he's a fine option. Martin Maldonado, 3,500. The Astros are one of the better stacks on the slate. Pretty much for the most part, Colorado, Houston, Washington, and I don't know if I'm forgetting someone off the top of my head, but they're going to be like the top options on today's slate for offense. But anyway, Martin Maldonado, 3,500, going up against Nick Margevicius, the lefty. And the Astros just checking in as a really good stack on this slate. Now, Margevicius actually gave it more power to lefties last season with a 341 ISO and 11% strikeout rate and a 471 WOBA. So he's a bit reverse splitsy for sure. Much better walk rate compared to right-handed bats. But I think everyone's in play here, and I do like the Astros quite a bit. So Martin Maldonado, if you're just stacking the Astros, you can throw him at the end. He's not that cheap at 3,500, but he's certainly playable, and he's got some pop versus left-handed pitching. And then Austin Barnes, 2,400. I think he's just kind of an easy fill-in here. I don't love the Dodger stack, but I think you can use some of these righties here versus Andrew Heaney. He's the guy that does give up quite a bit of hard contact. Now, he does have a good strikeout rate, which is obviously a little concerning, 27% and 29%. So I hate using bats against guys with high strikeout rates, which is one of my concerns with the Rangers tonight, because Marquez definitely has some strikeout ability, but he does struggle more with lefties, so I do think we can target some of the lefties. But anyway, getting ahead of myself, Austin Barnes, he's just cheap, and if you're looking at his splits versus lefties, they're not great, but he's just a cheap throw-in. He does great as the better value catcher on the entire slate. Then dropping down to first base, I only have a couple of options here, but Coors Field in Washington for the most part. We have Daniel Murphy going up against Kyle Gibson. Kyle Gibson struggled in his last start versus the Mariners, so I'm not too confident in him having a great game here versus the Rockies in Coors Field. So the Rockies do check in as one of the best stacks on the slate, and they had the highest team total on the slate as well at 6.37. Murphy is not a big power hitter, but he's a decent contact guy, only a 13% K rate, 263 batting average versus righties, and 171 ISO. Not great numbers, but it's still fine. Kyle Gibson pretty much gives the same amount of power to both sides of the plate. Last season, 168 ISO to lefties, 168 ISO to righties. Higher WOBA to lefties, so, I mean, pretty much everyone's in play here. I'm not shying away from any of the Rockies, and unfortunately for Kyle Gibson, I don't think he's going to have the greatest start in the world tonight. And then we have two national bats, and Howie Kendrick and Eric Thames, both the same price tag. I'll probably just lean with the lefty here in Eric Thames because you get that lefty on righty matchup versus Wojciechowski, but both are fine options. Now, Kendrick, he's better versus lefties, but he's still got solid numbers overall versus righties. Last season, a 376 batting average to lefties, but Still a 327 batting average to righties, only a 12% K rate, 221 ISO, 381 WOBA, and 136 WRC plus. I like pretty much all the Nationals bats here. Now I'm surprised the total isn't higher, like I said, but Wojciechowski's not a guy I'm going to really shy away from. He does have some strikeout ability, but he's a guy that will give up power to both sides of the plate. 287 ISO to lefties and a 191 ISO to righties, and does give up quite a bit of fly balls as well. So I think all the Nationals are certainly in play here. Then you have Eric Thames, 4,000. He's not that great versus lefties, but versus righties, he does have a 275 ISO. I mean, he will strike out a lot. That's why I'm kind of thinking Kendrick's the safer play there, because, look, he's going to make contact. We know that. Only a 14% K rate and a 12% K rate. Thames, 30% K rate and a 30% K rate to both sides of the plate. So that's the risk with him, but 275 ISO, 122 WRC plus, and definitely some home run ability here, especially with Wojciechowski's power numbers given up to left-handed bats. Then dropping down to second base, we have Rougned Odor, 4,600. So I'm a little iffy on these Rangers here. I still think they're playable, but man, I feel like they're more GPP-ish than cash, to be honest, because they were so disappointing last night, and they're getting a tougher matchup tonight versus Marquez. I know in baseball, teams are going to have off nights, and that's very well what it could have been. So I'm by no means fading the Rangers. I'm just not sure if they'll make my cash game lineups today. I mean, I think maybe some of the cheap outfielders like Willie Calhoun and Shin-Soo Choo might, but if I'm going to use anyone versus Marquez, I'm going to prefer the lefties here, and Rougned Odor would check that box. Now, his problem is he strikes out a ton. 30% K rate to lefties and 30% to righties as well. He's got some power, though. So that's pretty much the only thing he's got going. If you're going to use anyone versus Marquez, you're going to want lefties. But I mean, versus righties, dark green bars, and you're 30% K rate, only a 4% walk rate, high ground ball rate, less than a 300 WOB, and only a 149 ISO. To lefties, those numbers will soften up a bit, 5% walk rate. Ground ball rate comes down a little bit. The ISO comes up to over 200, 328 WOB. He's a good pitcher, but definitely think we can use some lefties versus him in Coors Field. Then Nick Solak, I know he's a righty, but he went off last night, so I just threw him on here because he's the only Ranger that pretty much did anything for the most part last night. I think he went 3 for 4, if I remember correctly. Yeah, a homer. I think he had 2 doubles. He had a great night, so he's viable. He's also outfield eligible, but I do prefer the lefties for the most part. Then Chris Taylor, if you just want a cheap option, he's also eligible at second base or at shortstop as well. He's only 3,200. Gonna go to Andrew Heaney. We'll give up some hard contact and some fly balls. And if you're looking at splits versus lefties, not too bad. 262 ISO, 255 batting average isn't great. Does strike out quite a bit, but I think he's a fine option for cheap if you're looking for a value bet. I mean, I don't love using guys versus Heaney. I mean, the high strikeout rate sucks, but it does give up a decent amount of fly balls and 226 ISO to lefties and a 196 ISO to righties. So I think some of these Dodger bats are fine. Third base, kind of a loaded position here. Arenado, Bregman, Turner, Machado, and then Asdrubal Cabrera is the cheaper option. But we'll start with Arenado here. Gibson gives up pretty much the same amount of power to both sides of the plate. Arenado is great versus both sides of the plate. And look, I prefer him versus lefties in Coors Field, but I like all the Rockies here for the most part. 258 ISO to righties, 315 batting average, only a 13% K rate. I don't think Gibson's going to have a good time in Coors tonight, so I think we can use all these Rockies bats, and I would have no problem if you want to play Arenado in cash games because he's owned Arenado and he's in Coors Field, and the Rockies get a much softer matchup tonight compared to last night versus Lance Lynn. Then Alex Bregman, 5,500. I like the Astros quite a bit. They're going to be one of the better stacks on the slate. Team total 5.28. I would imagine that's probably going to come up as the day goes on. And Nick Margevicius, he was actually worse versus lefties last season, but that doesn't mean he was great versus righties either. Still a 186 ISO and an 18% strikeout rate and near double-digit walk rate. So I think you can load up pretty much everyone in the Astros here. We know Alex Bregman's great versus left-handed pitching. Last season, a 400 ISO, 205 WRC plus, and a 350 batting average and with an 11% strikeout rate. So certainly don't mind Bregman if you are stacking up the Astros. Justin Turner, 4,800, just a cheaper righty versus Andrew Heaney if you're looking at Turner splits versus lefties. On your 300 ISO and just overall pretty solid numbers all around in your 300 batting average. So I don't mind Justin Turner. I'm not sure if I really want to stack the Dodgers here, but I don't mind some of the righties. You can also look at the lefties in tournaments because Heaney does give up power to lefties as well, but I'm kind of liking some of these cheaper righties just to throw in as one-offs in your lineup. Then Manny Machado, 4,600. He goes up a lefty as well. We have 3 guys in a row that both hit left-handed pitching really well. So don't mind Machado either. He had amazing numbers versus lefties. 370 ISO last season, 177 WRC plus, 685 slugging, over 300 batting average. If you're looking at Alex Young's numbers, we're definitely going to want righties versus him compared to lefties. Pretty strong numbers versus lefties last year, but versus righties, 20% K rate, 200 ISO, 320 WOBA. So we can certainly look Machado's away. And then just to use another Washington bat, we have Asdrubal Cabrera here. He comes in at 4,000. And if you're looking at his splits, he's better versus right-handed pitching, but still kind of similar numbers overall. Just a little bit more power, though. 194 ISO, 99 WRC plus. Not the greatest numbers in the world, but I do like all the Washington bats here for the most part, and he should have a pretty decent spot in the order. So do like Mr. Cabrera. Then dropping down to shortstop, we got 4 options here, and we got 3 good spin-up options and an absolute pump play. But we'll start with Trevor Story, going up against Kyle Gibson. Pretty much the same exact reasons I mentioned with Nolan Arenado, so I'm not going to go too in-depth there. But Story was great versus right-handed pitching last season, actually had more power versus them, and Gibson's just not a guy I'm going to be too scared of on this slate, so don't mind Trevor Story. Fernando Tatis Jr., 5,600, going with the lefty, and Alex Young. We know Tatis is great versus left-handed pitching. Over 300 ISO, a 223 WRC plus, 419 batting average, and near 20% walk rate. Overall, just amazing numbers. So I don't hate some of these righties on the Padres. Just look at Will Myers and Tommy Pham, but I don't have them listed here, but I think they're fine. But really do like Tatis and Machado if you want to use some of the infield for the Padres. They just have such good numbers versus left-handed pitching. Then Trey Turner, if you're stacking up the Orioles last season, he had more power versus righties. Had a better batting average with lefties, but still overall really good numbers versus righties. 220 ISO, 360 WOBA, 120 WRC plus, and a 512 slugging with a near 300 batting average. Wojciechowski, he's got some decent numbers, but he's not someone we're too scared of. Plus the Orioles bullpen, so I think the Nationals are one of the better stacks on the slate for sure. And then if you want an absolute punt play, you could look at Luis Garcia. I apologize, I don't know which one, but he's projected to make the lineup here. He's only 2,000, batting 7th, but he's just dirt cheap. So if you need an absolute punt play to fit in a Patrick Corbin or whatnot, I don't mind it. I mean, Wojciechowski, we have no statistics on him for the last year, but I don't hate it. It's not the worst play in the world. And he did score 14 points in his first game last night, so we'll give him that credit. So if you need a punt play, I don't mind Garcia here for one of the better offenses on the slate. Then dropping down to the outfield, Charlie Blackmon, for reasons I don't really think I have to explain. He's been one of the best batters in the entire league so far this season. We're in Coors Field. You get a lefty on righty matchup. Yeah, he's going to be a fantastic play. Juan Soto, 5,400. I like all the Washington bats here for the most part, and I do prefer the lefties versus Wojciechowski. And if you're looking at Soto's splits versus righties last season, excellent numbers, a 303 ISO, 155 WRC plus, 281 batting average, and just amazing numbers all around. 416 on base percentage. I don't think I have to go too in depth there. I like the lefties versus Wojciechowski, who does give up a near 300 ISO versus them. Joey Gallo, 5,300, did absolutely nothing last night, which can be said for most of the Rangers. I mean, they just absolutely were dreadful last night, but I don't mind going their way in GPPs. I don't think these guys are cash locks for the most part, but, well, I wouldn't fault you for Chu or Calhoun and cash, but Joey Gallo, I'm not really sure if I'm going to get all the way up there because, man, they were disappointed last night. They only have a 5.13 implied team total, but Marquez is a guy we can use lefties against for sure. His numbers do drop off quite a bit, and this outfield is all lefties. So I wouldn't fault you for using them in cash games. I'm just not sure if I'm going to get there today just because, man, last night really was sour, but I know teams can have off nights, so I'm not someone that's going to just be recency bias and say they suck last night, so you can't play them tonight. I'm not like that at all. I'm actually the complete opposite. If a team sucks last night, I don't really care as long as they're in Coors Field and the matchup's somewhat decent. I'll go ahead and play them again. I'm not really someone that puts too much into stock of what happened the night before, but Marquez is a solid pitcher, so that's why I'm saying I don't think we have to. It's not like we have Cal Fralin on the mound, so we can just load up on the other team's bats, but because I do respect Marquez's talent, but I don't mind Joey Gallo here. He's got a ton of power versus righties. Now, the problem is he does strike out a ton, which with Marquez, there's definitely a potential for him to strike out 4 times tonight because Marquez certainly has some strikeout upside, but I do prefer the lefties versus him over at 200 ISO, giving up 20% K rate, so the numbers do fall off quite a bit compared to righties, so I think Gallo's fine. JD Martinez, 4,700. I think James Paxton's somewhat interesting, but anytime Martinez is going up against a lefty, I got to have some interest. And he actually has some good history versus James Paxton. I'm not one to use BVP because I think it's kind of pointless for the most part. But if you guys like BVP, I'll have some numbers here for you. Okay, so JD is 8 for 19 with 2 homers versus James Paxton. So there you go. But yeah, I mean, his numbers versus lefties are insane. So pretty much like, yeah, his BVP is good versus James Paxton, but JD Martinez's BVP is pretty much good versus any lefty. I mean, if you're looking at his numbers, 242 WRC plus, a 400 batting average, 482 ISO, 539 WOBA. I mean, anytime he's going up against a lefty, he's in play. He's only 4,700. Then we have George Springer should be leading off here versus Marjavicius. And I mean, the Astros scored 9 runs in the first inning last night, maybe 10 runs, but they went absolutely off. I think they should have another solid outing again. They're one of the better stacks on the slate. So I like George Springer here. He comes in at 4,600, and I think he's a fine option. We know he's pretty good versus left-handed pitching. Last season, he was much better versus righties, but overall, I'm not going to fade him versus a lefty. So I like all the Astros here for the most part. So Michael Brantley, I'm not sure if he's going to end up making the lineup with Alvarez back. I mean, it's kind of been a little bit iffy, but if he does make the lineup, you guys know I like him. Now, I prefer him versus right-handed pitchers, but Marjavicius was reverse splitsy where he gave up more power to lefties and just overall worse numbers. So I think we can certainly look Brantley's way. Now, he's not as good of a player versus lefties compared to righties, but he's fine for the price tag. And anytime I like the Astros and Brantley's in the mid-range, I'll put him on the sheet. I'm not sure if he's going to make the lineup, so if he does, I like him. If he doesn't, obviously don't like him. Then Alvarez, only 4,300, and this guy is just an absolute beast versus lefties and versus righties, so I think he's one of the better plays on the slate. Don't really care about a lefty-on-lefty matchup, and then at some point he'll see a righty anyway. But look at his numbers. Same amount of power compared to righties versus lefties. 342 ISO to lefties, 342 ISO to righties, and just overall elite numbers. Over a 300 batting average to lefties, 171 WRC plus, 649 slugging. Don't care about a lefty-on-lefty matchup here, and plus Marjavicius gives up more power to lefties, so I think Alvarez is actually one of the best plays on the entire slate. Love the price tag, love his upside, and I love the Astros, so yeah, I like Alvarez quite a bit. Shin-Soo Choo, 4,300, and Willie Calhoun at 3,800. Pretty much the same plays here, so I'll group them together. I mean, Calhoun's got some more power if you're looking at his splits versus righties. 246 ISO compared to Choo's 214. Also has a better batting average. So if you had to pick between the two, I'm going to go with Calhoun here just because he's cheaper, but I think both are fine options. And if you want to play them in cash, totally understand that because they're cheap enough and they're in Coors Field, and I do like the lefties versus German Marquez. Then Adam Eaton, just getting a cheap Washington bat. It's going to be hitting near the top of the order. It doesn't have a ton of power, but he's got some decent splits versus righties with the 152 ISO, 366 on base percentage, 276 batting average. Doesn't strike out a lot whatsoever at only 15%, double-digit walk rate. And Wojciechowski, 287 ISO give him to lefties. And I gotta say, Wojciechowski is one of the funnest names to ever say. So I was like saying his name. But yeah, like the lefties here versus Woj there. And then AJ Pollock, if you just want a cheap righty bat versus Andrew Heaney. Pollock's always had some decent splits versus lefties. 323 batting average last season, a 212 ISO, and just overall pretty solid numbers. So that's pretty much going to be it for the video, guys. I hope it was helpful. If it was, remember to leave a like. If you're new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out. I really do appreciate it. Check out my NASCAR video if you haven't already. I'll be going live tomorrow around 12 or 1 o'clock. Probably 1 o'clock because then we'll have baseball walking at 1. So I guess wouldn't want to be live an hour beforehand. So, all right. Appreciate you guys watching. Enjoy your weekend and see you guys in the next video.